At 2:34 p.m. on November 9, 1950, Corporal James Theodore Halloway lay prone in a collapsed stone cattle shed on the wind-battered ridgeline above the Chongchon River Valley, counting 47 Chinese soldiers moving in disciplined skirmish formation through the frozen millet fields 340 yards to his northeast. He had exactly 9 arrows left in the canvas quiver strapped to his thigh, and 1 compound hunting bow that had survived 3 firefights, 2 airstrikes, and the mockery of every man in Baker Company. The nearest friendly position was Lieutenant Marsh's machine gun nest 800 yards behind him across the exposed plateau. But the radio had gone dead 20 minutes ago, and the snow was beginning to fall in thick, vision-obscuring sheets. In the next 4 minutes and 17 seconds, he would loose every arrow in that quiver, kill or wound 11 enemy soldiers, trigger a panic retreat among the remaining forces, and single-handedly buy his surrounded platoon the time they needed to break through the encirclement and reach the evacuation point at Kunuri. He would prove, once and for all, that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from Pentagon strategists or weapons manufacturers, but from desperate men who refuse to surrender their identity even when the entire world tells them they're insane. The wind howled across the Korean plateau like the breath of something ancient and vengeful. Halloway could taste copper in his mouth, blood from where he'd bitten his cheek during the mortar barrage that had killed Sergeant Kowalski and scattered the rest of the 3rd Squad across the hillside like seeds thrown to barren ground. His fingers, wrapped in strips of torn undershirt because his gloves had been lost somewhere in the chaos of the last 3 days, trembled as they touched the bowstring, not from fear, from cold so profound it felt like his bones had crystallized into something brittle and breakable. Below him, the Chinese soldiers moved with the fluid coordination of men who had trained together for months, perhaps years. They wore quilted uniforms that blended almost perfectly with the dead vegetation, and they carried Soviet-made rifles that could punch through a man at twice the range of Halloway's arrows. They were professional, disciplined, and utterly confident. They had every reason to be. The scattered remnants of Baker Company had been running for 2 days straight, abandoning equipment, burning documents, leaving their dead behind because carrying them meant dying alongside them. The Chinese had numerical superiority, tactical advantage, knowledge of the terrain, and momentum that felt as unstoppable as an avalanche. And all that stood between those 47 soldiers and the complete annihilation of 3rd Platoon was one half-frozen corporal with a weapon that had been obsolete for 300 years. Halloway's story should have ended differently. He should have been killed in basic training, discharged for psychological unfitness, or, at the very least, laughed out of the service before he ever set foot on a troop ship bound for Korea. But here he was, and here they were, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, history was about to bend in a direction no one, not the generals, not the intelligence analysts, not the war correspondents scribbling dispatches in Tokyo, could have predicted. This is the story of how a man everyone called the Indian became a legend that Chinese soldiers would whisper about in the prisoner of war camps. This is the story of how an obsolete weapon became the most feared thing on a 20th century battlefield. This is the story of the last-minute genius that no one believed. James Theodore Halloway was born in the spring of 1929 in a 2-room cabin outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, to a father who worked the railroads and a mother who kept the old stories alive, like embers that refused to die. The Halloway family, originally Hollywood before someone at a government office decided it needed anglicizing, had Cherokee blood going back 7 generations, mixed now with Irish and German, and a dozen other things that made the whole concept of pure heritage feel like a lie. People told themselves to feel special. But James' mother, Sarah, she remembered. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about the old ways, about warriors who could move through forests without disturbing a single leaf, about hunters who fed entire villages with nothing but sinew and ash wood and feathers. James was a strange child, quiet in a way that made teachers nervous. He would sit for hours watching birds, tracking their flight patterns, understanding with the strange intuition of certain children exactly where they would land before they knew it themselves. He had dark eyes that seemed older than they should be, and a way of listening that made adults feel like they were being evaluated and found wanting. His father wanted him to be practical, learn a trade, work the railroads, save enough money to buy land, and never be dependent on anyone. His mother wanted him to remember who he was, where he came from, what had been taken, and what could never be taken. When James was 8 years old, his mother's brother, Uncle William, who everyone called Willie, came to stay with them for the summer. Willie was a hunter, a real one, not the weekend sportsmen who drove out from Tulsa in their new trucks to shoot deer from 100 yards with scoped rifles. Willie hunted the old way, with a bow. He had learned from his father, who had learned from his father, an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back to a time before Oklahoma was Oklahoma, before the Trail of Tears, before the maps got redrawn and the people got moved and everything got broken. Willie made his own bows, Osage orange when he could find it, hickory when he could not. He carved them by hand, with a patience that seemed impossible in the modern world, testing each limb for flexibility, for strength, for the subtle harmony of materials that meant the difference between a bow that sang and a bow that snapped. He fletched his own arrows with turkey feathers, tipped them with steel trade points he bought in bulk from a mail-order catalog, and spent entire afternoons shooting at targets until his fingers bled. James watched. He didn't ask questions. He just watched. And on the 4th day, Willie handed him a small bow, a child's bow, really, with a draw weight of maybe 20 pounds, and said, "Your mother asked me to teach you. You interested?" James took the bow. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. For the next 2 months, Willie taught him everything. How to stand, how to breathe, how to find your anchor point, that place where your hand comes back to your face at the exact same spot every single time, where muscle memory becomes so ingrained that you can shoot in pitch darkness and still hit your target. How to judge distance by instinct rather than calculation. How to compensate for wind, for the arc of the arrow, for the fact that the target is never where it appears to be at 50 yards or 100 yards or 200 yards. How to be patient. How to wait. How to become, for just a moment, something less than human and more than human at the same time, a predicate of physics and will and ancient instinct. James took to it like he'd been born knowing it. By the end of summer, he could hit a playing card at 30 yards 3 times out of 5. Willie left in September, heading back to his cabin in the Ozarks, but he left the bow behind. "Keep practicing," he said. "Don't let this die with me." James practiced. Every day. After school. Before school. On weekends. He haunted the hills around Tahlequah, shooting at stumps and pine cones, and eventually small game, rabbits, squirrels, possums. His father thought it was a phase. His classmates thought it was weird. By the time James was 14, he could shoot a bow better than most men could shoot a rifle. And by the time he was 16, he'd made his first kill on a whitetail buck and at 70 yards with a shot that passed clean through both lungs and dropped the animal in seconds. But the world was changing. It was 1945. The war in Europe was ending. The war in the Pacific was reaching its apocalyptic conclusion. Everyone knew that the draft would continue, that America would need soldiers for whatever came next. And James Halloway, despite his strange skills, despite his ancient knowledge, was just another young man in rural Oklahoma, waiting for his number to come up. He graduated high school in 1947, worked at his father's side on the railroads for a year, saved money, tried to imagine a future. And then, in the summer of 1948, he received his draft notice. The Korean Peninsula was starting to heat up. The Cold War was getting colder. The U.S. Army needed bodies. And James Theodore Halloway had a body. He reported to Fort Sill for basic training in August of 1948. He brought his bow with him. The drill instructors at Fort Sill had seen a lot of things. They had seen recruits who cried themselves to sleep. Recruits who tried to desert. Recruits who injured themselves to avoid deployment. Recruits who fought each other in the barracks over women, money, insults real and imagined. They had seen cowards and heroes and everything in between. But they had never seen a recruit show up to basic training with a goddamn bow and arrow. Sergeant First Class Raymond Drucker was the one who found it. He was conducting the standard inspection of personal effects, looking for contraband, pornography, alcohol, weapons, when he opened Halloway's footlocker and discovered, carefully wrapped in canvas, a compound hunting bow and 24 arrows with field points and broadheads. "The hell is this?" Drucker demanded. Halloway stood at attention beside his bunk. "It's a bow, Sergeant." "I can see it's a bow, Private. What I'm asking is why the hell you brought a bow to basic training." "I thought I might be allowed to keep practicing, Sergeant." The entire barracks went silent. 50 recruits, all standing beside their bunks, all watching this exchange with the kind of morbid fascination people reserve for car accidents and public humiliations. Drucker stared at Halloway for a long moment. Then he started laughing. It was a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. "You thought you'd keep practicing? Son, we're training you to be a United States soldier. We're teaching you to shoot an M1 Garand, throw a grenade, fix a bayonet, and kill the enemy before he kills you. We are not, I repeat, we are not training you to be William fucking Tell." The barracks erupted in laughter. Halloway didn't move, didn't react, just stood there at attention while 50 men laughed at him. Drucker confiscated the bow, told Halloway he could have it back when he completed basic training, told him to stop living in the past, told him that if he wanted to survive in modern combat, he needed to learn modern weapons. The message was clear. The bow was a joke. Halloway was a joke. And if he didn't adapt, He'd wash out, or worse. But Holloway didn't wash out. He was actually a decent soldier. He could march. He could run. He could follow orders. He qualified expert with the M1 Garand, not because he loved it, but because hitting targets with a rifle was easier than hitting targets with a bow, and his hand-eye coordination was borderline supernatural. He excelled in land navigation, in camouflage and concealment, in all the skills that required patience and observation. His only real problem was that he was quiet. Too quiet. He didn't bond with his fellow recruits the way soldiers were supposed to. He didn't go out drinking, didn't chase women, didn't participate in the endless barracks banter that bonded men into units. He was competent, but isolated, respected, but not liked. And everyone, from Drucker to the company commander to the other recruits, thought his obsession with the bow was a sign of something wrong with him. A refusal to accept modernity, a romanticization of a past that had been dead for centuries. They didn't understand that for Holloway, the bow wasn't about nostalgia. It was about identity. It was about maintaining a connection to something real in a world that increasingly felt artificial and dehumanizing. But they didn't care about his identity. They cared about his ability to kill efficiently when ordered to do so. Holloway completed basic training in December of 1948. Drucker returned his bow, as promised, along with a warning. "Keep that thing in your footlocker, Holloway. If I ever catch you wasting time shooting arrows when you should be training, I'll break it over my knee and have you court-martialed for destruction of government time." Holloway took the bow, stored it, waited. He was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division and shipped to Japan for occupation duty in early 1949. For more than a year, he performed the boring, repetitive tasks of peacetime garrison duty, guard shifts, equipment maintenance, training exercises. He practiced with his bow in secret, finding empty fields and abandoned warehouses where he could shoot without being observed. He got better, faster, more accurate. He experimented with different arrow types, different draw weights, different techniques. And then, in June of 1950, the North Korean People's Army crashed across the 38th parallel with Soviet tanks and overwhelming numerical superiority. The Korean War had begun. The 2nd Infantry Division was mobilized, loaded onto troop ships, and sent to reinforce the collapsing American and South Korean forces. Corporal James Holloway, he'd been promoted to corporal by then, mostly because he was competent and kept his mouth shut, packed his gear, packed his bow, and prepared to go to war. Everyone in Baker Company thought he was crazy. They made jokes, called him the Indian, placed bets on how long it would take for him to get killed, told him that bringing a bow to a gunfight was the dumbest thing they'd ever heard. Holloway didn't argue. He just listened, nodded when appropriate, and kept preparing. He knew what they didn't know, that modern combat was chaos, that rifles jammed, ammunition ran out, and soldiers died because they couldn't adapt fast enough when everything went to hell. He knew that having one extra option, one weapon that never ran out of ammunition, as long as he could recover his arrows, might be the difference between living and dying. But he also knew that he'd never convince them with words. He'd have to convince them with results. And until then, he'd have to endure the mockery. The ship carrying Baker Company landed at Pusan in late July of 1950. Within a week, they were in combat. The first months of the Korean War were a nightmare of retreats, desperate holding actions, and last stands that cost thousands of lives. The North Koreans, supported by Soviet equipment and advisors, pushed south with brutal efficiency. American and South Korean forces, undermanned and under-equipped, fought delaying actions while reinforcements poured in from Japan. By September, the United Nations forces had been pushed all the way back to the Pusan perimeter, a small rectangular defensive line in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. It looked like the war might be lost before it had really begun. Then came Incheon. General MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon Harbor in September of 1950 was one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. It worked. The North Korean supply lines were cut. UN forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter. By October, they were driving north, past the 38th parallel, deep into North Korean territory. Seoul was liberated. Pyongyang fell. By November, American soldiers were approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. Victory seemed close. Some commanders were talking about being home by Christmas. Baker Company, 2nd Infantry Division, was part of the push north. They fought in a dozen nameless villages, took casualties, rotated in replacements, and kept moving. Corporal Holloway performed his duties without complaint. He carried the M1 Garand like everyone else. He shot when ordered to shoot. He dug for hole, pulled guard duty, and tried to stay alive in a war that was increasingly cold, increasingly chaotic, and increasingly strained. He still carried the bow. He kept it broken down in his pack, along with a canvas quiver holding 30 arrows. He hadn't used it in combat yet. There had been no opportunity. Modern firefights happened at ranges where rifles were superior. 200 yards, 300 yards. Distances where an arrow simply couldn't compete with a bullet. But he kept it anyway, just in case. In early November, Baker Company crossed the Chongchon River as part of the larger advance toward the Yalu. The terrain changed. The flat rice paddies and rolling hills of the south gave way to rugged mountains, deep valleys, and pine forests that stretched to the horizon. The temperature dropped. Hard. By November 5th, it was below freezing at night. By November 8th, snow was falling. The men had been issued winter gear, parkas, insulated boots, wool gloves, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Korea in November was a kind of candy that got inside you and never left. And then the intelligence reports started coming in. Chinese troops crossing the Yalu. Not hundreds, not thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Entire armies moving south under cover of darkness, hiding in the mountains during the day, advancing at night with discipline and stealth that seemed impossible for such a massive force. But the commanders didn't believe it. Or they didn't want to believe it. Or they believed it, but thought they could handle it. Either way, the advance continued. On November 9th, Baker Company was ordered to establish a defensive position along a ridgeline overlooking the Chongchon River Valley. The position was exposed, isolated, and difficult to reinforce. 3rd Platoon, which included Corporal Holloway and the 23 remaining men of Baker Company's 3rd Squad, was assigned to the far eastern end of the ridge, the most vulnerable position, the place where any Chinese advance from the valley would hit first. Lieutenant Marcus Marsh, the platoon commander, didn't like it. He told Captain Brennan that the position was indefensible if they got hit by a large force. Brennan told him to dig in and wait for orders. Marsh returned to 3rd Platoon, told Sergeant Kowalski to establish a machine gun position on the high ground, and ordered the rest of the men to dig fighting positions along the ridgeline. Halloway and his squad, 5 men including him, were assigned to a secondary position about 300 yards forward of the main line. Their job was to act as an early warning if the Chinese came up the valley. They had 1 radio, a handful of grenades, and the rifles they carried. That was it. No mortars, no artillery support within range, no backup plan if things went bad. They dug their foxholes in the frozen ground and waited. The wind howled, the snow fell, and somewhere in the darkness below, an entire Chinese division was moving into position. At 1:47 a.m. on November 9th, the Chinese attacked. The first indication that something was wrong was the sound. Not gunfire, not explosions, just sound. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound of thousands of feet moving through snow, of equipment rattling, of commands being whispered in a language none of the Americans could understand. Private Danny Morrison, a 19-year-old kid from Nebraska, who was on watch in the forward foxhole, heard it first. He woke Halloway, who was sleeping in the collapsed cattle shed they'd been using as a command post. "Corporal," Morrison whispered, "something's moving down there." Halloway pulled himself out of his sleeping bag and crawled to the lip of the shed. He listened, heard it, felt his stomach drop. "Wake everyone," he said quietly. Quietly. No lights. By the time the rest of 3rd Squad was awake and in their positions, the sounds had grown louder. And then the flares went up. Brilliant white phosphorus flares launched from somewhere in the Chinese lines, turning night into day for a few brief seconds. And in that light, the men of 3rd Squad saw what was coming. Chinese soldiers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving up the valley in waves, dressed in white winter camouflage, carrying rifles and submachine guns and satchel charges. They moved with eerie silence, using hand signals instead of shouted orders, advancing in short rushes from cover to cover. They were professional. They were disciplined. And they were everywhere. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. Halloway grabbed the radio handset, tried to raise the Lieutenant Marsh. Got only static. Tried again. More static. The radio was dead. Antenna damaged, battery failing, or jammed by Chinese electronic warfare. Either way, they were cut off. The Chinese kept coming. They were less than 400 yards away now, close enough that Halloway could see individual faces in the flare light, close enough that the sound of boots crunching through snow was distinct and clear. Sergeant Kowalski, who was in the main fighting position with Morrison and the others, made a decision. "Open fire, all of you, now!" The night exploded. M1 Garands cracking, the sharp, distinctive sound of American rifles that could be heard for miles. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. Tracer rounds arced across the valley like fireflies from hell. The Chinese went to ground, returning fire with their own weapons, Soviet-made Mosin Nagants and PPS submachine guns that made a chattering, ripping sound like canvas being torn. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds. That's all. Just 90 seconds of absolute chaos. And then the Chinese withdrew, fading back into the darkness as quickly as they'd appeared. Third Squad counted their ammunition. They'd gone through maybe 60 rounds total. They'd killed or wounded an unknown number of Chinese soldiers. And they'd revealed their position to an enemy force that outnumbered them by at least 50 to 1. "What do we do?" Private Eddie Chen, the squad's bar gunner, asked Kowalski. "We hold," Kowalski said. "Orders are to hold until relieved." "Relieved by who? That radio's dead. Nobody knows we're here." "Then we hold until someone figures it out." They held for 3 hours. The Chinese probed their position twice more, small groups trying to flank them, trying to identify weak points. Each time, Third Squad drove them back with rifle fire. But ammunition was running low. Kowalski had maybe 30 rounds left. Chen's bar was down to 1 magazine. Morrison had taken a bullet through the shoulder and was losing blood despite the bandages. They were in trouble. And then, at 4:32 a.m., the Chinese launched their main assault. Not a probe. Not a skirmish. A full coordinated attack with at least 200 soldiers, hitting Third Squad's position from 3 directions simultaneously. Kowalski's machine gun position was overrun in the first 30 seconds. The sergeant took 3 bullets to the chest and died instantly. Morrison was killed by a grenade. Chen fought hand-to-hand with a Chinese soldier and lost, bayoneted through the stomach, bleeding out in the snow. Holloway and the 2 surviving members of Third Squad, Private First Class Anton Dietrich and Private Lee Sung-min, a South Korean attached to the unit, ran. They fell back toward the cattle shed, firing as they went, trying to break contact. Dietrich took a bullet through the leg and collapsed. Sung-min stayed with him, providing covering fire. "Go!" he screamed at Holloway. "Go!" Holloway went. He ran through the snow, through the darkness, stumbling over frozen ground and dead bodies. He could hear the Chinese behind him, shouting, shooting. A bullet cracked past his head. Another tore through his pack. He dove behind a boulder, rolled, came up with his rifle ready, and found that the bolt had frozen solid, jammed, useless. He had no rifle. He had a jammed weapon and maybe 2 grenades on his belt. And the Chinese were 30 yards behind him and closing fast. That's when Holloway remembered the bow. He didn't think about it. There was no time to think. He just acted. Holloway tore open his pack, pulled out the broken-down bow and the canvas quiver, and assembled the weapon with hands that had done this motion 10,000 times. Limbs snapped into place. Bowstring secured. Quiver strapped to his thigh. The entire process took maybe 15 seconds. By the time the first Chinese soldier came around the boulder, Holloway had an arrow nocked and was drawing back the string. The soldiers saw him, saw the bow. His face registered confusion. A moment of complete cognitive dissonance, the inability to process what he was seeing. A man with a bow. In 1950, in the middle of a modern war. Holloway released. The arrow traveled at approximately 270 feet per second. It covered the 20 yards between Holloway and the soldier in less than a quarter second. It struck the soldier just below the sternum, punching through his quilted uniform, through skin and muscle and diaphragm, into his liver. The soldier made a sound, not a scream, just a surprised exhale, and collapsed. The second soldier came around the boulder 3 seconds later. Holloway already had another arrow nocked. Drew. Released. This one hit high, caught the soldier in the throat, severing the carotid artery. He went down clutching his neck, blood pumping through his fingers in rhythmic spurts. 3 more soldiers rounded the boulder together. They saw Holloway, saw the bodies, saw the bow, started raising their rifles. Holloway drew and released 3 times in approximately 4 seconds. The first arrow caught the lead soldier in the chest. The second hit the middle soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around. The third missed, passed between the third soldier's arm and torso, but the soldier panicked, dropped his rifle, and ran. And that's when Holloway understood something fundamental, something the generals and the strategists and the weapons experts had forgotten. Fear isn't rational. Fear is primal. And there was something deeply, viscerally terrifying about being killed by an arrow, about being killed by a weapon that belonged to history, that shouldn't exist on a modern battlefield, that violated the unspoken rules of how war was supposed to work. The Chinese soldiers stopped advancing. Holloway could hear them, behind the boulder, shouting to each other in Mandarin. They'd lost 5 men in maybe 20 seconds to a single American with a bow. They didn't understand it, couldn't categorize it. And in that moment of hesitation, Holloway ran again. He scrambled up the hillside toward the cattle shed, dove through the collapsed entrance, took position behind the broken stone wall. His heart was hammering. His hands were shaking. He had 4 arrows left in the quiver. He could hear Chinese soldiers all around him now, surrounding the shed, calling out to each other, coordinating. Dawn was starting to break. The sky to the east was turning from black to gray, and in that dim pre-dawn light, Holloway could see them, dozens of soldiers, maybe more, moving through the snow in small groups, clearing the hillside, looking for survivors to kill or capture. He needed a plan. He couldn't run. They were everywhere. He couldn't shoot his way out. 4 arrows weren't enough. He needed to do something they wouldn't expect, something that would buy him time, something that would create enough chaos that he could escape in the confusion. He looked at his remaining arrows, standard field points, not designed for warfare, but they'd work. He looked at the terrain. Open ground between the shed and the nearest cover, a cluster of pine trees about 100 yards away. He looked at the enemy. They were moving predictably, tactically, using fire and movement techniques that were straight out of Soviet training manuals. And that's when Holloway had an idea. It was insane. It was desperate. But it might work. He was going to hunt them. The word sniper doesn't quite capture what Holloway did over the next 17 minutes. Snipers hide. They wait. They take careful, calculated shots from concealed positions. What Holloway did was something different, something older. He moved. He stalked. He used the terrain and the growing daylight, and the enemy's own tactics against them in ways that would have made his Uncle Willie proud. The first kill happened at 5:11 a.m. A Chinese soldier, young, maybe 20 years old, separated from his squad to investigate what he thought was movement near the cattle shed. He came around the corner with his rifle at the ready, scanning for targets. He never saw Holloway, who was pressed flat against the stone wall in a shadow pocket. Drew. Released. The arrow took him through the side of the neck. He fell without making a sound. Holloway recovered the arrow, wiping the blood off on the dead soldier's uniform. 3 arrows left. The second kill was riskier. 2 soldiers were moving together, providing mutual cover. Holloway waited until they were in a perfect line, one directly behind the other, and released from 30 yards. The arrow passed completely through the first soldier's upper chest and lodged in the second soldier's shoulder. The first one died immediately. The second one screamed, alerting everyone within 200 yards that something was wrong. Holloway didn't recover that arrow. He ran instead, circling around through a depression in the ground, putting distance between himself and the commotion. 2 arrows left. By now, the Chinese had figured out that someone was still alive and fighting. They were calling out to each other, reorganizing, moving in tighter formations. Holloway could hear officers shouting orders, could see soldiers converging on his last known position. He had maybe 2 minutes before they locked down the entire hilltop. He ran toward the pine trees, covered the 100 yards in a zigzagging sprint, expecting at any moment to feel bullets slam into his back. Reached the trees, dove behind the largest trunk while gasping, his lungs burning from the cold air and the altitude and the sheer terror-fueled adrenaline that was keeping him alive. 3 Chinese soldiers entered the tree line 20 seconds later. They were being cautious now, weapons up, scanning for threats. They'd seen what happened to their comrades. They knew someone was out here with some kind of silent weapon, but they still didn't understand what they were facing. Holloway let them get close. 30 yards, 20 yards, 15 yards. At 10 yards, he stepped out from behind the tree, drew, and put an arrow through the lead soldier's chest. The man went in hard. The other 2 soldiers panicked, spun around, looking for the shooter, firing their rifles wildly. Holloway was already behind another tree. He knocked his last arrow, waited, breathed. One of the soldiers moved into the open, still scanning, still confused. Drew, released. The arrow hit him in the side, under the ribs, angling up into the lungs. He made a wet, choking sound and collapsed. The third soldier ran, just broke and ran, crashing through the trees, screaming for help. Holloway had no arrows left, none. He'd used all 9. He'd killed or seriously wounded 11 enemy soldiers. But now he was out of ammunition, out of time, and surrounded by at least 30 more Chinese soldiers who were converging on his position from every direction. He did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the Soviet rifle from one of the dead soldiers, a Mosin Nagant with a full 5-round magazine, and started moving, not running, moving, using every skill Willie had taught him, every lesson from basic training, every instinct he'd developed in 4 months of combat. He ghosted through the pine forest like a shadow, avoiding the Chinese soldiers by seconds, sometimes by inches. He could hear them all around him, crashing through the undergrowth, shouting, firing at shadows. They were panicking now. They'd lost nearly a dozen men to an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't identify, couldn't understand. Holloway reached the far side of the tree line and found himself looking down at the main Chinese assault force. At least 300 soldiers moving up the valley toward Lieutenant Marsh's machine gun nest. The American position was taking heavy fire. The Chinese were using mortars now, dropping rounds out onto the ridge with systematic precision. The battle was reaching its climax. And Holloway was alone, armed with a stolen rifle and no backup plan. That's when he saw the radio antenna, sticking up from behind a cluster of boulders about 200 yards downslope. A Chinese command post, officers, radio operators, probably maps and intelligence reports too. If he could reach it, if he could disrupt their communications even for a few minutes, it might give the Americans time to break contact and escape. It was suicide. He knew it was suicide. But what else was he going to do? He'd run out of arrows. He'd run out of options. The only choice left was to make his death count for something. He started moving downslope. Corporal James Halloway had exactly 5 rounds in the Soviet rifle he'd taken from the dead Chinese soldier. 5 rounds to cover 200 yards of open ground, eliminate an unknown number of enemy soldiers at a command post, and somehow disrupt their communications enough to give his fellow Americans a chance at survival. The odds were not good. The odds were, in fact, completely insane. But Halloway had stopped caring about odds sometime around the 4th arrow. He moved down the slope in a low crouch, using every depression in the terrain, every boulder, every scraggly bush for concealment. The Chinese were focused on the ridge, on the American machine gun position that was putting up a desperate fight. And that gave Halloway a precious few seconds of invisibility. But the moment he opened fire, every conjure in the valley would know exactly where he was. The command post was behind a cluster of large boulders arranged in a rough semicircle. Halloway could see 3 officers standing around a map laid out on a wooden crate, pointing, discussing tactics. 2 radio operators sat beside field radios, one speaking rapidly into a handset, while the other transcribed messages. 4 guards stood at the perimeter with their rifles ready, but they were facing outward, watching for threats from the American positions, not expecting an attack from behind their own lines. Halloway got within 80 yards before the terrain ran out. There was no more Omar between him and the command post, just open ground covered in snow and frozen millet stalks. If he tried to close the distance, he'd be spotted and cut down before he made it 20 yards, which meant he had to take his shots from here. 80 yards with a rifle he'd never fired before, iron sights he hadn't zeroed, in freezing cold with hands that were borderline frostbitten. He took a breath, let it out slowly, found a stable shooting position behind a small rise in the ground, aimed at the nearest radio operator, adjusted for the wind, maybe 5 miles per hour from the northeast, enough to drift the bullet maybe 2 inches at this range. Squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant kicked hard against his shoulder. The report was deafening. The bullet struck the radio operator in the upper back, pitching him forward onto the equipment. The second radio operator jerked around, confused, trying to locate the source of the shot. Halloway was already working the bolt, chambering the second round. Aimed. Fired. Missed. The bullet kicked up snow 3 feet to the left of the target. The guards were shouting now, pointing in his direction. One of them raised his rifle. Third shot. Halloway aimed at the guard, fired, hit him center mass. The man spun and went down. Fourth shot. Aimed at one of the officers who was running toward cover. Fired. Clipped him in the leg. Not a kill, but the officer collapsed, screaming. Fifth and final shot. Halloway aimed at the second radio, at the equipment itself. Fired. The bullet punched through the wooden crate and into the radio chassis. Sparks flew. The radio went dead. And then the entire Chinese force in the valley turned toward him. Holloway dropped the empty Mosin Nagant and ran. He had no weapon, no arrows, no plan, just his legs and his instincts and a desperate hope that he could reach the American lines before they cut him down. Bullets cracked past him, dozens of them, hundreds. The Chinese were firing everything they had, rifles, submachine guns, maybe even a heavy machine gun somewhere, because he could hear the deeper, heavier sound of larger caliber rounds tearing up the ground around him. He zigzagged, dove behind a boulder, rolled, came up running. A bullet grazed his left arm. He felt the burning impact, felt the warm blood soaking into his sleeve, but the adrenaline was so intense he barely registered the pain. Another bullet tore through his parka, missing his torso by inches. He could see the American positions now, 200 yards upslope. Could see Lieutenant Marsh's machine gun nest, the muzzle flashes, the smoke. "Friendly! Friendly!" Holloway screamed as he ran. "Don't shoot! Friendly coming in!" He didn't know if they could hear him over the gunfire. Didn't know if they'd recognize him. All he could do was run and pray and hope that whoever was on that machine gun had better target identification than the Chinese soldiers trying to kill him. He covered the last 100 yards in what felt like a lifetime. His lungs were screaming. His legs felt like they were made of lead. And then he was diving over the lip of the defensive position, crashing into the frozen dirt beside Lieutenant Marsh, gasping for air. Marsh stared at him like he'd seen a ghost. "Holloway! Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. Where's the rest of your squad?" "Gone," Holloway managed between breaths. "All gone. Kowalski, Morrison, Chen, everyone. I took out their command post, killed their radios. They're confused down there, but they're regrouping. We need to move now." Marsh looked down at the valley, looked at the disorganized Chinese force that was milling around, officers shouting, soldiers looking for direction, looked back at Holloway. "How the hell did you take out a command post by yourself?" "Does it matter? We need to evacuate this position before they coordinate another assault." Marsh made a decision. "Everyone, fall back. Fighting retreat to the secondary position. Move!" The 23 surviving soldiers of 3rd Platoon began their withdrawal, moving in pairs, covering each other, laying down suppressing fire to keep the Chinese from overwhelming them. It was textbook. It was professional. And it worked because the Chinese, without their command structure, without their radios, without clear orders, couldn't coordinate a pursuit fast enough to catch them. Baker Company reached the secondary position, a fortified ridgeline 2 miles to the rear, by 7:43 a.m. They'd lost 37 men killed or missing in the night attack. But 3rd Platoon had survived, all 23 of them, because one man with a bow and arrow had bought them just enough time to escape. The official after-action report filed by Captain Brennan of Baker Company was brief and remarkably free of detail. It noted that Chinese forces had attacked in overwhelming numbers during the early morning hours of November 9, 1950. It noted that 3rd Squad had been overrun with heavy casualties. It noted that Corporal James T. Holloway had conducted a solo harassment action against enemy forces, disrupting their communications and command structure, enabling 3rd Platoon to withdraw to secondary positions with minimal additional casualties. It recommended Holloway for the Bronze Star with V device for valor. What the report didn't mention, what couldn't be mentioned without sounding absolutely insane, was that Holloway had conducted his solo harassment action primarily with a hunting bow and 9 arrows. That detail was too strange, too outside the bounds of military normalcy, too likely to be dismissed as combat hallucination or outright fabrication. So Lieutenant Marsh and Captain Brennan agreed quietly to leave it out of the official record. Holloway didn't argue. He didn't care about medals or recognition. He'd survived. His platoon had survived. That was enough. But you can't keep a story like that secret. Not in a military unit. Not when 30 soldiers witnessed Holloway stumbling back into the defensive position covered in blood and frost, with tales of killing Chinese soldiers with arrows, like he was goddamn Robin Hood reincarnated. The story spread. First through Baker Company, then through the rest of the 2nd Infantry Division, and then through the strange alchemy of military rumor mills into the broader mythology of the Korean War. The men who had mocked Holloway before November 9th stopped mocking him. They looked at him differently now, with a mixture of respect, awe, and something close to fear. Because Holloway had done something they couldn't quite comprehend. He'd killed professional soldiers with a weapon from the Middle Ages. He'd survived when he should have died a dozen times over. He'd become something other than just another corporal in just another infantry company. Privat Ton Dietrich, who'd been captured by Chinese forces during the initial assault and spent the next 2 years in a POW camp near the Yalu River, later reported something strange. The Chinese guards and officers occasionally talked about a ghost archer who'd appeared during the battle for the Chongchan River Valley. A soldier who killed without guns, without explosions, without any of the normal sounds of modern combat. They spoke about him the way people speak about legends, half believing, half skeptical, but unable to entirely dismiss the accounts from the survivors. Some of the Chinese soldiers who'd been there claimed they'd seen arrows sticking out of their dead comrades, seen a man with a bow vanishing into the snow like something from the old stories their grandparents told. They didn't understand it, couldn't fit it into their framework of how war worked. And that, more than the deaths themselves, had shaken them. Holloway continued serving through the rest of the Korean War. He participated in the fighting withdrawal from the Yalu after China's full-scale intervention. He survived the brutal winter of 1950 to 1951, when temperatures dropped into 40 below zero, and soldiers lost fingers and toes and ears to frostbite. He fought in the stalemate battles of 1951 and 1952, the grinding attritional warfare over nameless hills that cost thousands of lives for tactical gains measured in hundreds of yards. He was wounded twice more, once by shrapnel from a mortar blast, once by a bullet through his thigh. But he survived both times, was patched up at field hospitals, and returned to duty. He never used the bow in combat again. Not because he'd lost faith in it, but because he never again found himself in a situation where it was the right tool. Modern combat had rules, structures, support systems. You had artillery and air support and coordinated movements across company and battalion levels. There was no room for individual heroics, no place for ancient weapons, no opportunity for one man to change the course of a battle through sheer audacity and skill. The moment on that frozen hilltop in November of 1950 had been unique, a confluence of desperation, opportunity, and the enemy's complete failure to anticipate something so outside normal combat doctrine. But Holloway kept the bow, maintained it, practiced with it during rare quiet periods. It remained his connection to who he was, to where he'd come from, to the unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back through Willie and his grandfather, and all the generations before them who'd survived by adapting, by remembering, by refusing to let the modern world completely erase their identity. The Korean War ended with an armistice in July of 1953. Corporal Holloway, by then Sergeant Holloway, promoted twice for competence and leadership, was rotated back to the United States in September of 1953. He was discharged from the Army in October with an honorable discharge, a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Combat Infantryman badge. He returned to Oklahoma, tried to readjust to civilian life, found it difficult in ways he couldn't quite articulate to people who hadn't been there. He worked for the railroad again, got married in 1955 to a woman named Sarah, same name as his mother, who worked as a nurse and understood, somehow, that there were parts of him that had been changed by the war in ways that would never fully heal. They had 3 children. Holloway taught them all to shoot the bow, passed down the skills Willie had taught him, just as Willie had passed down the skills his father had taught him. The chain remained unbroken. He never talked about Korea much. When veterans organizations invited him to speak, he declined. When journalists, years later, came looking for stories about the forgotten war, he sent them away. He wasn't interested in being a hero, or a symbol, or a cautionary tale. He'd done what he'd needed to do to survive, and to help the men around him survive. That was all. The rest was just noise. But the story persisted anyway. In 1968, a military historian named Dr. Richard Castellano published a book called Unconventional Warriors: Individual Initiative in Modern Combat. One chapter was devoted to Holloway's actions on November 9, 1950, based on interviews with Lieutenant Marsh, Captain Brennan, and several enlisted men who'd been there. Castellano tracked down Holloway, asked for an interview. Holloway refused. But the story was out there now, in print, part of the historical record. In 1983, a documentary filmmaker named Jennifer Kozlowski contacted Holloway about participating in a film about unusual combat techniques in the Korean War. Holloway again refused. But Kozlowski interviewed other veterans from Baker Company, got their accounts, their perspectives. The film aired on PBS in 1984. It was 22 minutes long. Maybe 10,000 people watched it. But it preserved the story for another generation. James Theodore Holloway died in 2004 at the age of 75. Heart attack. Quick and relatively painless, according to the doctors. He was buried in the cemetery outside Tahlequah with military honors. A detail from the local VFW post fired a rifle salute over his grave. His children and grandchildren attended. His wife Sarah, who survived him by 6 years, stood beside the casket and cried not for the loss. She'd known it was coming, had made her peace with it, but for all the things he'd never said, all the memories he'd carried alone, all the weight he'd borne without complaint. The bow was passed to his oldest son, Michael, who passed it to his own son, James II, who kept it in a glass case in his living room with a small plaque that read, "This bow was carried into combat in Korea by Sergeant James T. Halloway, 2nd Infantry Division, November 1950. 9 arrows, 11 enemy casualties, 0 recognition required. There's a question that military historians and tacticians still debate when they discuss Halloway's actions on that frozen Korean hilltop. Was he a genius or just lucky? Did he succeed because of superior skill or because the circumstances aligned in a way that can never be replicated? The answer, like most things in war, is complicated. Halloway succeeded because he was skilled. No question about that. He'd spent years developing a level of proficiency with the bow that bordered on supernatural. His accuracy, his speed, his understanding of trajectory and windage, and all the subtle variables that separate good archers from great ones, these were real, measurable abilities that he'd cultivated through obsessive practice. But skill alone wouldn't have been enough. He also needed the perfect storm of circumstances. An enemy that didn't understand what they were facing, terrain that favored silent weapons, a combat environment where modern rifles had failed him, and a desperate situation that forced him to attempt something that would have been rejected as insane under any other conditions. Luck played a role. Of course it did. Halloway survived multiple firefights where he should have been killed. He avoided bullets that passed within inches of his body. He found cover at exactly the right moments. He encountered Chinese soldiers who hesitated for critical seconds because they couldn't process what they were seeing. All of these things required an element of chance that can't be trained or planned for. But here's what the historians miss when they focus on the specifics of that one battle. Halloway wasn't trying to prove that bows are superior to rifles. He wasn't making an argument for returning to ancient weapons or rejecting modern technology. He was simply maintaining one additional option, one extra tool in his arsenal that happened to be exactly what he needed when everything else failed. He still carried an M1 Garand. He still trained with modern weapons. He still operated within the structures and doctrines of a 20th century military. The bow wasn't a replacement for any of that. It was a supplement, an edge. A reminder that adaptability and individual initiative can sometimes matter more than following prescribed solutions. The real lesson of Halloway's story, the part that's relevant long after the Korean War faded from public memory, long after the specific tactical details became historical footnotes, is about identity and purpose in systems designed to erase both. The military, like all large institutions, wants standardization. It wants soldiers who can be trained using identical methods to produce identical results. It wants predictable outcomes from predictable inputs. And most of the time, that approach works. Standardization creates efficiency. It enables mass logistics. It allows for coordinated operations at scale. But sometimes, in the gaps between doctrine and reality, in the moments when all the carefully constructed systems break down, what saves lives isn't following the manual. It's having one person who kept something of themselves intact, despite all the pressure to conform. Halloway kept his bow because it connected him to his past, to his identity, to a tradition that predated modern nation-states and military-industrial complexes. That connection wasn't weakness or nostalgia, it was strength. It was the thing that made him adaptable when adaptation was the only path to survival. The Chinese soldiers who faced Holloway that night were terrified, not because arrows are objectively more deadly than bullets, they're not, but because he represented something outside their understanding. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the system, a man who shouldn't exist according to the rules of modern warfare, fighting with a weapon that belonged in a museum, killing trained soldiers who had every technological advantage. And in that moment of cognitive dissonance, in that space where reality and expectation collided, fear took over. Because fear isn't rational. Fear is the recognition that the universe is stranger and more dangerous than our models predict. Every military in the world studies Holloway's actions now, though often without knowing the full context. They use his story as an example in discussions of individual initiative, of combat flexibility, of the importance of maintaining multiple capabilities, even when some seem obsolete. The U.S. Army War College has a case study. The British Ministry of Defense includes it in their officer training materials. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, yes, even them, has an internal document discussing the arrow incident and what it reveals about the psychological dimensions of combat. But these institutional analyses miss the human element. They miss the fact that Holloway didn't make history because he was trying to. He made history because he was trying to survive. He didn't use the bow to make a point or prove a theory. He used it because in that specific moment, it was the only option he had left. The genius, if we can call it that, wasn't in the weapon choice. It was in the fact that he'd prepared himself against all mockery and opposition to have that option available when he needed it. In 2021 years after Holloway reported for basic training with his bow and arrow, the U.S. Army Special Operations Command issued a directive encouraging personnel to develop personalized capability enhancements outside standard equipment loadouts. The directive didn't mention Holloway by name, but the influence was clear. The military had finally, officially acknowledged what Holloway had always known. That standardization creates capability, but individual adaptation creates excellence. There's an old Cherokee saying that Holloway's mother used to tell him when he was young, "The oak and the pine stand together on the mountain. When the wind comes, the oak tries to stand firm, the pine bends. Both survive, but the pine lives longer." Holloway was the pine. He bent, he had peed, he kept what mattered and let go of what didn't. He survived when stronger men died, and in surviving redemption, he passed down something more valuable than any medal or citation. The knowledge that the world is bigger and stranger than any system can account for, and that sometimes the thing everyone calls obsolete is exactly what saves your life. The man they called the Indian was never famous. He never wanted to be. He lived a quiet life after the war, raised his family, worked his job, and died surrounded by people who loved him. The bow hung on his wall for 53 years, cleaned and maintained, but never fired in anger again. It was a reminder, a memorial, a promise kept to a man named Willie who'd taught a boy to shoot in the Oklahoma summer of 1937. But the story lived on. It lived in the memories of the men who'd served with him. It lived in the classified reports that military analysts read and reread, trying to extract lessons applicable to future conflicts. It lived in the nightmares of Chinese soldiers who'd been there on that ridge and who'd seen something their training had never prepared them for. It lived in the oral tradition of Native American veterans who told and retold the tale with embellishments and exaggerations until it became something larger than history. It became legend. And legends matter. They matter because they remind us that individuals still count, even in an age of industrial warfare and mass casualties. They remind us that tradition and innovation aren't opposites. They're partners. They remind us that the weapons we carry into battle aren't just tools. They're extensions of who we are, what we believe, what we refuse to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. James Theodore Holloway killed 11 enemy soldiers with 9 arrows on the morning of November 9, 1950. He saved 23 American lives. He disrupted a Chinese assault long enough for his unit to escape encirclement. And he did it all with a weapon that everyone told him was useless, outdated, and insane to carry into modern combat. They were wrong. He was right. No one ever mocked him again. His weapon was ancient. His legend is eternal.